On today's show, Bobby Manning joins me to talk about Brad Stevens' press conference to explain the Jaylen Brown trade. And later on, I give you my pick for where I think LeBron should play next. But before that, I'm going to run through some of these offseason moves that I feel sure about and some that I don't feel so sure about, including the Jaylen Brown trade. Let's jump in. All right, now that the first wave of the offseason is over, we can all sit back, take a breath, and I thought I could go use this time now to go through some of the moves that stood out to me, including the ones that I'm very sure about my feelings on, and then the ones that I'm still sort of trying to figure out how I feel about. So I'm going to go back and forth between the ones I'm sure about and the ones that I'm unsure about, but I'm going to start with the Clippers, and I feel sure about the Clippers moves, not just this offseason, but really since February's trade deadline. The Clippers reset to me is a textbook masterclass in how to pivot out of one era and start into a new era. This is just A pluses to me all around, and I feel very sure about this. So you look at the Kawhi and the Harden trades, and then even the Zubac trade also. With Kawhi and Harden and Zubac, you get younger and you get draft picks in every deal. And then with Kawhi and Harden in particular, you actually got younger guys who had been all-stars before, plus draft capital for your aging stars. You end up between the three trades, Kawhi, Harden, and Zubac, a total of 4 first-round picks, a first-round pick swap, 5 second-round picks, Darius Garland, Brandon Ingram, Grady Dick, Benedict Mathurin, Isaiah Jackson. You draft Keaton Wagler with that 5th pick that you got from Indiana that ended up breaking your way. Masterclass in pivoting. And you did it in a way where you traded Harden right as the extension talks got a little bit prickly and before you lost real leverage in that. And you found a team in Cleveland midseason that was desperate for him. So you somehow found a way to operate from a position of strength while trading James Harden when he's made an entire career of making it so that his teams operated out of position of weakness and forcing his way out of places. The one team to actually trade him and get real value back, it seems at least, more than what people had expected. In Kawhi, even with all this aspiration business, you trade Kawhi for more than what Boston got for Jaylen Brown, right? You're able to turn that into a position of strength. And then you trade Zubac to a team that was just desperate to find a center, and you ended up getting the 5th pick in this draft out of it, that in a draft that you had no business picking in. And you ended up getting a guy who a lot of people really like in Keaton Wagler, who I think is going to be a really good fit. I don't know how many of these young guys will be around long term, right? I know that there's pros and cons to Brandon Ingram's game. How long will Darius Garland be there? Can he stay healthy? Is Wagler going to be any good? Benedict Mathurin, I know they still have to deal with his restricted free agency, all these things, but you get a flyer on guys like Isaiah Jackson and Grady Dick, both players who I think could be worth a shot as role players in the future. Who knows what it works out for the Clippers here? But now they have a ton of options. And if I'm a team around the league that's thinking about pivoting off of my current era, I am studying what the Clippers just did over basically 2 transaction cycles between the trade deadline and this offseason, and saying, okay, when we eventually have to pivot off of this era, this is how we do it. So A+ by the Clippers, great work. I feel very sure about that. I also feel very sure about the 76ers moves. Not necessarily the Jaylen Brown one, which we'll talk about here in a second, but I feel very sure about their additions of Dean Wade and Anthony Simons. These are role players that are being acquired by the 76ers to play very specific roles, and I always like that. Dean Wade, analytics darling, 3-and-D role player, can get up threes, stretch the floor, defends at a high level, can defend multiple positions. I know they lose Kelly Oubre and Quentin Grimes. I think they got better. I think they got better with these moves, with those specific roles. Dean Wade is just going to do more stuff than Kelly Oubre is going to do. I like Oubre. I think he plays really hard. He's a little bit trick or treat in terms of what you're getting every single night. But with Wade, he's just going to play that role. His whole thing is, can he stay healthy enough to be out there? And with Simons, he's a knockdown 3-point shooter who's going to be coming off the bench for this team. He's going to replace basically what they lost when they traded away Jared McCain. And they needed that guy. And you go out and get that guy at $25 million a year. I didn't really love Anthony Simons, but at this kind of money, I've always liked Simons' game. And at this money, at 12-ish million a year, I think it makes a lot of sense. So now you're getting Simons on his role player contract, ready to play a role. I think it makes a lot of sense. All right, a move that I'm unsure about. Jaylen Brown. Now, I'm going to talk about, with Bobby Manning here in a second, a lot more about the Celtics side of the Jaylen Brown trade. But to talk about this from the Philadelphia side, I know that this is a slam dunk move, right? You're trading Paul George and 2 first-round picks. It would have cost you at least one of those first-round picks, maybe both, to get off of Paul George's salary. There was reporting around the situation that they were already trying to shop Paul George. The fact that and salary dump him. The fact that you get Jaylen Brown, I've seen people say that, well, you're kind of getting Jaylen Brown for free. All right, I get it. But the reason and I do think you have to do this if you're Philadelphia, right? Like if I'm the GM and this is the call I'm getting, I'm like, yeah, we're doing this trade. I think it's a trade that's directed more towards Tyrese Maxey than it is Joel Embiid. And I can see why, if you're the Sixers, you're saying, we're going to be building around Maxey and Jaylen Brown. And if Jaylen Brown wants to be the number 1 option, we'll deal with that. But we think that this pairing could work as long as we can get Jaylen Brown to buy in. Okay, here's the but part. Now we're building, as the Sixers, around 2 huge salaries who we all agree aren't worth those salaries. You look at Jaylen Brown's money, 57, 62, 67, and going to be due an extension within a few weeks. Joel Embiid, under contract, 57, 62, 67, same contract as Jaylen Brown. Jaylen Brown is a very good player. He's a top 25 player, getting paid like a top 8 player. Slightly overpaid for what he is as a player. Joel Embiid, a former MVP, injury history, not what he was, overpaid for who he is as a player. One of the worst contracts right now, as it looks in the NBA. It's really hard, and this is eventually the calculus that the Celtics did, and the conclusion that they came to was, we just can't build around 2 guys. And the 2 guys that they were building around was one, Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown, and the other one was Jaylen Brown. Tatum, who they really believe is the number 1 option. Jaylen Brown, who they don't think it is. But those 2 guys at least won a championship together, and they already made the decision, we can't do this anymore. In today's NBA, we can't pay 2 guys like this. So now if I'm Philly, I'm sitting here and saying, yeah, the value was incredible, but now we're building a team where our 2 biggest contracts are tied to guys who are either slightly overpaid or wildly overpaid in the case of Joel Embiid. Meanwhile, I've got Tyrese Maxey here, who's probably going to make similar money when his next contract kicks in. And I still have VJ Edgecombe, who I really like. And it feels like the latest moves take more off of his plate as opposed to putting on his plate, which, if I'm a Philly fan, I wanted to put more on VJ Edgecombe's plate after what I saw from his rookie year. So, again, you have to make this move if you're Philly. I get it. But I'm still unsure about how I look at the fit and where you ultimately go here. Because it kind of feels like to me the Sixers got better, but they also kind of boxed themselves in. And I don't know if that step forward was worth ultimately putting a ceiling on what your team could be. Now, if they're able to find a taker for Embiid, go for it. But they did also trade away 2 first-round picks in that Paul George deal. So it's going to be harder to find a suitor for Embiid now. So, yeah, I think they got better, but they also boxed themselves in, and that's why I feel a little unsure about it. I feel sure about the Giannis trade. Not surprising. I always liked the fit in Miami more than in Boston, more than in Portland, Minnesota, whatever other teams we wanted to come up with. Ultimately, Giannis felt the same way, whether it was because of the lifestyle, the salary that the Heat were willing to offer him, all these things. But it was, to me, the Heat were operating from a spot of desperation. 4 straight years in the play-in tournament, missed the playoffs altogether this last year. Even during the tail end of the Jimmy Butler year, there was a sense that this team needed to make a huge move. It's why they were involved in Damian Lillard, Kevin Durant. Ultimately, just didn't want to go all in for those guys. Knowing that Giannis could be a potential, guy that they can go get. And then as soon as he was available, they thought they were going to get him in February at the trade deadline. They finally got him this offseason. They moved a lot of pieces. I don't think that they lost a ton of depth in this trade. You lose a guy like Yakachonis and Jaquez, who everybody likes, Khalil Ware, who everybody liked his ceiling. But, and then obviously Tyler Hero, who would have been, ironically enough, a great fit next on a team with Giannis, but you had to include his salary. I just think it's going to work. I think we're focused way too much on the shooting part of this. Giannis, Bam, Spo, you still have Wiggins and Davion Mitchell. That's going to be, I think, one of the best 3 defenses in the NBA next season. It's going to be an elite defense. And the Heat have been good defensively over the last few years. They've been top 10, but we kind of throw out around that top 10. There's a difference between a top 10 defense and an elite defense. The Heat have always been a good defense the last few years. They have not been an elite defense for a very long time, right? Their defense kept them in games, but their defense did not win them games. This defense now can win them games, right? Their rebounding and running is going to be off the charts, all right? That is going to be the foundation of this team. Get stops, rebound the ball, get out in transition. That's what this team is going to be. And then offensively, look, I know that there's concerns about the three-point shooting. They added Tim Hardaway Jr., which is a move that was obvious and I like for them. But I look at the 2 teams that were in the NBA Finals, the Knicks and the Spurs, bottom half of the league in three-pointers made per possession. You don't have to be elite at three-point shooting to win the championship anymore. And I look at the top teams in the league last year, whether it was San Antonio, New York, Oklahoma City, Denver. Like the top teams in the regular season were teams that dominated in the paint, not from three-point range, right? The Charlotte Hornets were the best three-point shooting team in the league last year, and they missed the playoffs. Giannis is a walking, rim-dominating offense. They're going to dominate at the rim. Now, the spacing might not be there. Giannis doesn't need a ton of space. I don't know if you've noticed. They're going to have to figure it out. It's going to be a little clunky. I'm not saying it's an awesome fit. I'm not saying it's a perfect fit. I don't think there was a perfect fit. I think if Boston had to move everything that they had to move for Giannis, we're looking at that team very similar to being like, that's an aging core with some real questions about depth. And there's questions about fit. Portland, Minnesota never made sense to me for Giannis. So I'm very sure about this for Miami. I'm very sure about it for Giannis too. I think it was the right move for both parties. Unsure. I'm unsure about Ja Morant. I think it could work, right? I think, you basically just trade Jeremy Grant for Ja Morant straight up. As a value play, I like it. As a talent play, I like it. There's a world where, similar to the Giannis thing in Miami, yeah, there's fit concerns in the half court, but in the full court, I mean, if Portland is just getting out in transition with Ja Morant and Denny Avdia, I mean, that sounds like, hey, we're just doubling down on our strength. Portland was a great transition team last year. Ja Morant is a great transition player. And he immediately becomes the best passer on that team. And just high-level passing can create a lot of space, which is also my point with Giannis. Like, Giannis has created as many corner threes in the league as anybody outside of Jokic and Luka the last couple of years. Morant is an awesome passer, which is the thing that gets lost in his skill set all the time. So can he help kind of create that space with his passing? I think so. There's also the off-court things with Ja Morant. There's the contract that he has. And then there's that thing in Portland where it's just like, you've got a reputation now or a history now in Portland where you are just so over-indexed on small guards. Basically, since the Damian Lillard, CJ McCollum era, you've over-indexed on small guards and you've never really stopped. It's always been small guards. And I don't know, like, would you have just been better off not doing this and just standing pat? I feel unsure about that for Portland. I feel sure about the Hornets trading away LaMelo Ball, meanwhile. They are moving into the Con Knipple era. I think it's the right move. I think they basically realized, hey, LaMelo had a great year. We're coming off. We are still like riding high on the fumes of a great run there. If we're going to move LaMelo, now's the time to do it. And they did it. He played a lot of games, didn't play a ton of minutes, played a lot of games, was a positive on the floor, right? All the analytics were very favorable to LaMelo after this last year. And I think LaMelo's a good player, obviously has his issues. But my first thought was, yeah, this might be a step back for the Hornets. But it kind of reminded me of the Warriors trading Monte Ellis to make room for Steph Curry. Monte Ellis, fan favorite for Golden State fans back then, a very good but clearly limited player. A good player where it's like, hey, if this is our guy, can we really win a championship? And it feels like that's where LaMelo is headed. Good. Are we sure that this is the number one option for us on a team that can win a championship and really contend? And clearly the Hornets felt like that wasn't the case after their history with LaMelo. They've never gotten close. And they think Con Knipple can be that guy. And Brandon Miller, for the record. So I think this is a calculated step back to ultimately take a huge step forward. I'm buying everything that the Hornets are doing. I thought that was a sober move. I think it was the right move. And to be fair, I like it from Minnesota the more that I thought about it. I think LaMelo sliding into a role behind Anthony Edwards just makes a lot of sense. You're going to have a really hard time doubling Anthony Edwards. To me, this is all about not doubling Anthony Edwards. Anthony Edwards made it very clear he does not like being double teamed anymore. You put LaMelo on the floor, one pass away, you can't double Anthony Edwards, or you make it really hard to. So I like the move, though. I'm very sure about it for the Hornets. Unsure about the Lakers trading everything that they moved for Walker Kessler. Pros, 24 years old, huge, 7'2", rim protection, rebounding numbers stand out off the charts. If he's the next Rudy Gobert, this is a home run. This is a home run, and nobody thinks twice about the salary or the draft picks. It's a home run. But if he's not that, then that is a lot to give up. And this is also, I'll remind you, a guy who played 74 games as a rookie, and then 64, and then 58, and then 5. And I understand that there's a lot of haziness there with the Utah Jazz, sitting guys for minor injuries over the last few years while they blatantly tanked. But I still don't love the idea of his availability going down every season, given the history of centers in the NBA. And they already paid him before they saw him in a Lakers jersey. And this also has the potential to be a huge bust, where we gave up a ton of draft capital and paid this guy a huge salary, and now we're locked into this. You better be sure about this if you're the Lakers. And the way that they're operating, it seems like they're sure. And they've reportedly wanted this guy for a couple of years. But sometimes when you want the guy for too long, you ultimately end up making a wrong decision, right? It's like wanting a car forever and saving up and saving up and saving up. And then by the time you get that car, you realize, actually, a bunch of cars came out in those few years that are probably just better cars. And I probably should have just done that. Right? I don't know. It can go either way. I'm unsure. Last one that I feel sure about, the Miles Bridges trade. I feel sure about this, and I feel sure that Phoenix really screwed up. I just don't get it. I didn't get it then, and then the more I've thought about it, I've gotten it even less. All right? You ended up trading 2 quality rotation players in Royce O'Neal and Grayson Allen for a team that was really built on, we got Devin Booker at the top and then a lot of just like good players. We traded 2 of those good players who were major culture fits, didn't rock the boat, played really hard. We traded those guys plus an unprotected first in 2033. Before we could even really hold it, we got rid of it. The Suns just trading away unprotected first-round picks like they're burning a hole in their pocket. For Miles Bridges, who, would you consider him one of the best 100 players in the NBA? I would not. Yeah, you also got a heavily swapped pick in 2029, which is not going to be good. When you look at the protections, I won't get into them right now because it's boring and complicated, but look at them on RealGM.com. That pick's not going to be good, more likely than not. Miles Bridges is a player. Off the court stuff with the domestic violence stuff, okay, you wanted to bet on that guy. I've already got my issues with that, okay? But he's also been out of trouble for 3 years. Maybe you've done your research on him, you've done your background, you realize, okay, maybe the best basketball is ahead of this guy. Okay, maybe. All right. But he's also got this reputation as this super talented, athletic, physical forward, and he's really just more of an empty calories player. You can look at his box score stats. Oh, it's pretty good. He's smaller than you think, right? He's like 6'7". He was kind of billed as this jack of all trades player coming out of college. He's really not a jack of all trades guy. He's more of a lack of all trades guy. He was one of Charlotte's weaker defenders last season. He grabbed less than 6 rebounds per game last season. And he's a career 34% three-point shooter. He doesn't really do anything that well. And certainly you don't want him on the ball making plays for anybody. And then I think more than anything, I could really see Bridges and Dylan Brooks butting heads on who is the Robin to Devin Booker's Batman. And that's just not good. And what I liked so much about the Suns last year was their clear pecking order. Everybody knew their role, well coached, played really hard. And I think Miles Bridges coming in here being like, I was your big offseason acquisition. I'm going to try to get back to all-star status. Charlotte didn't value me. They moved along from me and LaMelo. Like, watch what I can do. I just don't love that. Now, maybe he doesn't do any of that. Okay. You still got rid of 2 rotation players for 1. And you did it by moving an unprotected first in 2033. The opportunity cost with that alone is enough reason to hate this move. So I feel sure that I hate this move for the Phoenix Suns. All right, those are the moves that I felt sure about and unsure about. I'm going to tell you where I would pick if I were LeBron James to go play next season. I'll tell you my favorite LeBron team in a little bit. But first, coming up, Bobby Manning on the other side of the break covers the Celtics and the NBA for CLNS. I'm going to ask him about that Brad Stevens press conference and whether or not we're buying or selling their reasoning for trading Jaylen Brown. All right, I'm here with Bobby Manning, who covers the Celtics and the NBA for CLNS, and we're talking the morning after Brad Stevens and Celtics owner Bill Chisholm spoke with the media to talk about the Jaylen Brown trade. Bobby, you were there. You covered it a bunch for a lot of different places, a lot of different things that you do over at CLNS. But what was your biggest takeaway from that press conference?
I'd say in terms of things we didn't know already, and Brad said it in a long opening monologue that began this thing 45 minutes yesterday. He and Chisholm talked for not only the salary cap implications of Tatum and Brown being at 70%, as he referenced several times, but them combined having such a massive usage on the team, which it's the first time we've heard a basketball justification on court dynamic issue that they felt like they needed to address in making this move. Now, we didn't receive answers to a bunch of other potential factors or questions for why this happened. Is the Tatum Brown dynamic and their ball time and their obviously ISO heavy play the driving force in this? Obviously, the cap is significantly too, but we got a sense as you read between the lines, and they clearly didn't want to disparage Jaylen or diminish their respect for his game. Brad even at one point said, like, if you have Jaylen, you should utilize him at that level. But they reference the massive usage of Tatum and Brown as alongside the cap and tax implications and roster building dynamic, almost equal, it felt like, in terms of attributing it to why they felt like they needed to move on here. But still a lot of unanswered questions beyond that. That was new. I don't think we had heard that yet, that they felt like maybe Jason and Jaylen were eating up too much of the ball time and offensive responsibility.
Yeah, so for maybe listeners who had not heard some of this stuff, I'm going to read a quick quote here. This was Brad Stevens talking about that 70% that he had referenced there before. He goes, the path looked a little bit more challenging with 70% of our cap and such a high percent of our usage tied into 2 players. The reality is this day and age at the NBA that you could see it, obviously, with the last couple of champions, you have to do a great job of building out depth that can hopefully replace that irreplaceable individual, end quote. So some good lawyer talk there by Brad Stevens, I think, but
he dodged a lot in this press conference for sure.
This was, to me, kind of taking everything as a whole. The final answer. This is Jason Tatum's team. And that question that all of you guys had for years about whether Tatum and Brown could coexist, maybe that wasn't a problem once before. Heck, they won a championship a couple of years ago with those 2 guys, but now it is something that they had to take on, and it kind of came to a head here, and they finally decided, no, we have to make it Jason Tatum's team once and for all these different reasons. The basketball reasons, they figured, hey, we can only really have one high usage guy, and if we can only have one, we pick Tatum. And we can only have one highly paid guy at this max type of salary, and if we have to pick one, we pick Tatum. And that was sort of my takeaway, as this is, nope, they picked Tatum at the end of the day.
Yeah, and those are intertwined to some degree. Like, obviously, you're going to be relying on 2 players in in large part if you're paying the most of the cap commitment on your team. And I think we always wondered, like, is it too duplicative? Are there too many overlapping attributes to their games? Are they actually complementing one another? And there was some comments on this presser referring to like Paul George's complementary play, how he fits in, that they like the way he can be utilized next to Tatum. And I do think that is referenced in contrast to maybe how they felt about Jaylen, in that these two weren't complementing one another at a high level, especially in that playoff series. And a lot has been made of Jaylen's analytics. They shied away from that conversation in this press conference, I think, just for the optics and the way that can be interpreted in terms of how they're running the organization right now. But you have to think that came into play too. The fact that not only have they not been a big plus team with Jaylen on the floor compared to when he's off, they've been a negative. And even with Tatum to some degree, they haven't gotten the absolute most out of his minutes when he's on the floor compared to when they're off. So it's going to be an interesting shift from trying to make it work for both those guys and obviously benefiting from both of their immense talents, to having two overall less talented guys and obviously a lot of depth around them, and seeing if making it a little more Tatum centric can get the best out of him and bring some more out of the players around him, which we've seen signs of. Like, they've won lineups that you can't even imagine winning their minutes with Tatum at the center of it. Like, it feels like you can play anyone with him and they'll eke out a positive through that stretch. And I know he referenced George's ability to do the same. So this, even though they wouldn't reference it yesterday, Wes, had to stem a lot from the analytics, the numbers they've built up over a long time, and certainly watching that Tatum Brown dynamic too, you would think.
It's hard to argue, right? Because they won the championship in 2024, but since then they haven't been best.
That's a big one. That's a big caveat that yes, they did 3 disappointing finishes around a championship. Pretty hard to parse.
Right? And so you could say, like, oh, we got a championship. On the same time, you could say, well, we got the championship. We accomplished what we needed to accomplish with this group. It's time to start looking ahead and looking forward. There's a version of this where the Celtics look really smart in doing what they did. Brad Stevens talked about how this was not an easy decision, how it kept him up at night. He understood the fan perspective from all of this, but ultimately they felt very convicted. And you could just tell, actions by their actions, right? They traded Jaylen Brown, and they did it with a level of urgency that I think surprised a lot of people trying to get this thing done early. They felt very convicted that we have to move off of this guy, that this is not Jaylen Brown plus Jason Tatum no longer works. And they haven't been back to the Eastern Conference Finals since they made the NBA Finals, or since they won the NBA Finals. And so you look at the way that they blow a 3-1 lead, and then Jaylen Brown is the guy that's available for those games. Tatum missed the last one. I could see why they might have come to this conclusion. Now, the trade in itself maybe is underwhelming, but that's a whole other thing.
So I think those are two different things. The rationale behind moving off Brown can be valid, while also acknowledging that they did not get enough return for the player in this deal.
Well, that's why I was going to ask you, did they come to this realization too late? Right? And I say that for 2 reasons. Number one, you could argue that they were trading Jaylen Brown at his highest value after 6th place MVP finish, 2nd team All NBA, all these things. I think the market would say otherwise, even though we look at what just happened and say, well, that is his highest value. It does feel like had they traded him earlier, he would have had more value. Like even last summer, maybe he would have had more value. And the other part of that too is they traded away a lot of depth to try to cut salary, right? Drew Holiday, Kristaps Porzingis, they had to get rid of so many guys in order to try to keep Tatum and Brown, to turn around a year later and then just dump Jaylen Brown. What do you think about that? Like, should they have just done this a year earlier and maybe held on to some of that depth, understanding that those guys were getting older anyway?
It feels like it. Now, there were reports last summer they fielded calls on Jaylen, so you have to assume that they got a sense then of what his value is. And there's been this whole saga has had the weirdest reporting to it attached all the way back to the Giannis stuff and how close they were on that. If you just threw an Ugo, or you get, do you get that done? That's another layer to this that we obviously didn't get much more new information to. The team's interested. I mean, you had Shams reporting Blazers interest that later the Athletic refuted entirely, like that Portland had no interest whatsoever in Jaylen. And Brad alluded to that yesterday too, that there was reporting of interest by teams that never even called. There is a lot from a reporting standpoint that was not accurate through this whole thing that makes it even harder to parse. I think in the end, at least from the team's portrayal of how this went down, they weren't as close on Giannis as many made it seem at that time. They did not have the level of widespread interest that it felt like at times throughout this process. And they, through the reports now and what Brad said yesterday, felt like this was the absolute best they could get. And you can talk up some of the stuff they got, but you have to think over the course of several years of evaluating Jaylen's value and their own sense of what his value is. And obviously, if they were this intent in moving off him and this urgent in doing so, you have to think that they had a relatively low sense of what his value was too. That 2 future firsts in this environment, and one really good one at that, when you're getting the better of LA and Philly in a few years, along with the flexibility to trade 5 firsts in an ensuing move and moving off Jaylen's contract before, I guess you would think they have a sense that it's going to get worse, that the value is going to go in a wrong direction from here. Maybe given the extension that he was due in a couple of weeks, maybe due to him being disgruntled and not being as committed to this, and him looking even more like a distressed asset going forward. Like, they had some sense, you have to think, that this was not going to get better, and they have to act on something like this now. The biggest outstanding question I have with that is one that's many have asked, and I know a lot of people around the league are wondering, is where was Paul George and 2 firsts going? Like that, you have to think that was not going off the table. So why not hold the line, wait, and see if someone gets hurt, if some other team has a desperate situation. I do think one thing that's interesting me, Wes, that we've seen in the reporting that's come out of this, and I think this is Bill Simmons who has referenced this, so who has not been super accurate through this whole process himself. But he referenced like Brooklyn having some interest in this, and then ultimately like their owner pulling the plug. You had reporting of Milwaukee having some interest in him and their owner pulling the plug. So were people around the league watching this whole saga play out and getting a little leery of committing to Jaylen themselves, given some of his commentary and his disgruntledness and certainly the contract extension that could have been due here? You have to wonder if like they were in a good place negotiating wise and his value was in a great place, and everything that played out over the last couple of weeks and months just shattered that.
That's what's interesting to me about this, because it's usually the reverse, right? The owner is sort of in on the big name, the guy who was getting MVP votes, former Finals MVP, guy that donned the Boston Celtics jersey. He's like, yeah, let's get that star into our system. And then it's usually the front offices that are thinking about
I was
the
so
money,
confused when that happened in Milwaukee.
right? I mean, like, hey, we have the analytics, we have the salary cap structure, we have a plan here, and if we acquire somebody like Jaylen Brown, it kind of messes up our plan. But in all of this reporting, it almost sounds like it's been the opposite, that these front offices have been a little interested in Jaylen Brown, and that the owners would be like, I don't want any part of this. And we get into thorny territory when you start talking about Jaylen Brown as a personality. And we've heard a lot of things out there, extreme, not extreme, nuanced, whatever it might be. But without diving into what Jaylen Brown's personality is and why it may or may not rub some people the wrong way, it feels like the only answer here is that owners look at Jaylen Brown and say, that's not who I want representing this organization for whatever reason. And I don't really understand the reason, to be clear, but we got at least now 2 owners somewhat on record, at least in terms of the reporting of this, being like, yeah, I don't really want to be in on the Jaylen Brown business. I don't want his, maybe it's the Twitch streams, maybe it's the whatever, maybe it has nothing to do with that. You know, I'm leaving that open to interpretation, but it feels to me like that might be the reason.
Yeah, I think the one that gets referenced is his comfort with his role. I think that'll be interesting in Philadelphia too, right? Because he doesn't go into the Sixers running the show and taking things over. He's, you could argue, third in line there in terms of ball time and responsibility. So I think many teams might have had some learniness. That doesn't explain their Bucks' disinterest with him. I think that related more to whether he actually wanted to be there and his contract commitment to that team and having a trade saga in short order after the Giannis one that consumed them for years. So I think that was their rationale. Brooklyn, I mean, they've been down the road of stars and drama and whether they're going to be committed to that situation in
That's
recent
probably what it
history
is,
too.
right? The owner was just like, I don't want to do this Kyrie, Kevin Durant. Let's just go chase stars thing again. Let's just build this thing.
Right. Yeah. And I think there's obviously Jaylen, the personality, and the controversy that seems to follow him. Again, through no fault of his own, it just seems like there's always a bigger conversation around him that does get in the thorny territory, as you mentioned. Even though he's not that controversial of a figure, it's
But
not like he's
as a basketball player, I think he might be the most polarizing player in the league right now in terms
yeah,
of
and it's
the
tough
view.
to identify exactly why.
Well, it's this
Um,
analytics conversation versus the resume. The guy's a Finals MVP and a champion
and the
not too long
contract,
ago,
right?
and But even before we get to the contract, because when you start talking contract with people, some people roll their eyes, right? Like even more casual fans. But like this has gotten to the point where a casual fan will weigh in on whether or not they think Jaylen Brown is a good player or not. And it's funny. I was talking with my co-host on Locked On Heat, and I was like, "What about this Jaylen Brown situation?" I was like, "Yeah." He's like, "Well, why don't people look at him as a top 10 player? He finished top 10 in All NBA and in MVP voting." And I'm like, "Yeah, but nobody believes it. They're like, hey, great season, pat on the head, but nobody thinks of Jaylen Brown that way." And then you talk to a casual fan, and they see the resume and the things that he's gotten, that he's accomplished, and they're just like, "Wait, why couldn't this guy be the number one on a basketball team?" And then you've got the analytics saying like, this guy's not even a good player, according to some people, like let alone worth this kind of money or being a number one. We think this guy might not even be a number two on a really high end team.
Yeah, and there's so many confluence of factors that drove us to this point, and you don't know how things might have gone in a different direction if something happened otherwise. But he gets this contract because he made All NBA in a weird year where guys were hurt, and he snuck in and earned that supermax status. And you weren't even sure then if that was a great idea, but they do it because it's better to keep them and figure out the contract later than have go to free agency in a year or two and
After he didn't play well in
potentially
the
leave.
playoffs, they
Right.
gave him
Yeah,
that
and that was
contract too.
controversial at the time too.
Mhm.
But it works out. They win a championship. He gets better and better. This past season, he reaches the peak, as you said, of his value. You would think, given what he accomplished, the team success, and his own individual standing in MVP conversations, returns to All NBA. So you think he affirms himself in this contract, and then in short order, you're hearing again how this doesn't necessarily work and the money's a challenge and all the things that we're discussing now. So it's weird that, as you mentioned, he has this success on the floor that you watch and you view the stats of, and you can see finals MVP on top of that. The analytics don't back that up. And he's on this massive contract that, from a number standpoint, a success standpoint, again, you could probably argue, like, yeah, he is a guy who deserves that level of investment money. Like, what should Jaylen Brown make given what he's done on the floor? It would be hard to argue less than this. But given how the league is set up, and Brad referenced this yesterday, that you do have to pay your best players this money if you're allowed to, and then you're also penalized for it from an apron and tax perspective, it puts you in a crunch that doesn't feel right. And this is like in the latest in a long running line of moves that just don't look good for the league, from Jaylen getting ousted here in Boston, obviously back to Luka last season, ending, and I know that's a different situation, but still is related to the money in the Supermax to some degree. Karl Anthony Towns, I think, in a very similar move from Minnesota, gets traded because he's not the best player on that team, but makes the most money. And you wonder if this will continue. Like, this town stay in New York after this championship. From a money perspective, they're already getting crunched. Like, there's just such a tight cap environment in this league. And you have to think that there was more to this than just the money, because they always knew what the money was going back to when they signed it. But this just keeps happening, and
Yeah.
it's too bad. Like, it hurts a lot of fans in Boston right now, and it is hurt this front office's image that they've moved off him in the way that they have. But they feel like this is going to be the right move. They acknowledged yesterday it's risky. They're not certain it's going to work, but they felt like they made the best decision. And I think you can talk yourself into it, but a lot of stuff has to go right for it to work out. And I think we're all sitting here wondering, like, what is the worst that would have happened if you just kept them?
And
And we didn't
that's
get
what
a
I
good
keep
answer
coming.
for that yesterday.
Yeah, were they asked that specific question, or some sort of version of it? Do you remember?
Yeah, one of the first questions was, why couldn't it have waited?
Yeah,
And it comes down to, you don't know if things are going to get better. You don't know if, like, things are going to change for the positive. And so if you get an offer that you feel like is satisfactory, you take it. And that is, I think that speaks to a lot, right? Like, we're wondering why the league isn't valuing Jaylen, but it also feels like the Celtics decided, like, okay, we've talked to all the teams. We've made our own assessment of what his value is
right.
to us. And this meets that threshold. And it's shocking, and I don't think it's the right decision. I'm curious what you think of the return, Wes, but it's not nothing. There's two good picks and a player who can fill in and becoming an expiring contract next summer. And like, we know what the Wolves got for Towns. We know what the Mavs got for Luka in different circumstances again, but like, you're not getting a massive return for some of these high price guys because
Yeah.
there just aren't enough teams in the market for that.
Yeah, I obviously when I see the trade when it first comes down, I'm like, that's it. Like that's crazy. Like I was flabbergasted, and I've sat on it. The more I've thought about it, and without, you know, you hear the response. Well, the Sixers basically got Jaylen Brown for free because they salary dumped Paul George onto Boston, which there were reports that they were already trying to sell on Paul George already. And you could argue that it would have cost them at least, a first round pick, maybe two first round picks, something close to this just to get off that Paul George salary. But then I think about it the other way, and I'm like, well, if we've all agreed that Jaylen Brown is overpaid, good player, overpaid, right? Like I said on this podcast before, he's a top 25 player getting paid like a top 8 player. That's a problem in today's NBA. Can't do it. So if we assume that it would have cost money, and by the way, Paul George is making $2 million, $3 million less than Jaylen Brown this year. So we're talking about very similar salaries. And Paul George, who I think most people agree is a much worse player than Jaylen Brown, certainly a lot more injury history and issues. If it would have cost you at least one pick to dump Paul George, wouldn't it have also cost you a pick to dump Jaylen Brown? It sounds crazy to think about it, but like if we just given the way that the NBA has responded to the Jaylen Brown contract, like the market has said this is what it is, and that's why I always said, like, even during the Giannis talks, everybody's like, oh well, the Bucks can just flip Jaylen Brown for more assets, and I'm like, well then just do it.
Well, that clearly wasn't the case
Right,
looking
it
back
clearly.
on it. And
Exactly. Like this idea that we just assume that the Clippers or the Hawks would move a top 8 pick for Jaylen Brown, clearly that was not the case. And so, if we assume, to go back to that, if we assume that Jaylen Brown, that you would have had to use draft capital to dump his contract, the fact that you didn't have to do that, and then you got 2 second-round picks, I think you can look at that as a win for Boston. Now, to your point, they could have just kept Jaylen Brown, it feels like, who's a good player, and they have a history of winning with him, but they obviously felt like they had to get off of this, which, are we just looking now at like a 2-year rebuild, Bobby, for the Celtics team? What was supposed to be like a 1-year gap while Tatum came back. Are we looking at essentially a 2-year gap year now, or a 2-year gap here?
It's certainly going to be 1 year at the very least, and they'll hold the line, which is the
Well,
positive
I'm
here.
sorry,
You
I'm
would
including
think.
last year. So last year and
Oh
then this
yeah,
year.
yeah,
So two
yeah.
years total. Yeah.
Yeah, and that makes some sense because you assess Jalen's value in the year he's by himself, and you get all eyes on him, and he's carrying things, and now you get to do that with Tatum post injury at 100%, starting fresh. So I think that'll inform some of their decision making going forward. Is just how effective Tatum proves in carrying this thing himself, alongside George, obviously, and others. Uh, and then you'll make a decision as opportunities arise of, do you want to cash in as many as 5 first-round picks for another player to this dynamic? Is that enough to get you to a championship? Or are you going to have to ride a slower draft and development curve, which honestly, I was so torn at that time. And I know we discussed it after the fact, Wes, of like, do you give up three first and the young guys for Giannis and just go in that direction. And obviously, I think a lot of people had that second guess right when the George trade happened of you could have just thrown in a little more for Giannis rather than end up in this place. But I do think it's actually an interesting discussion where they're at of going all in and limiting your flexibility even further and committing even longer to a supermax player in Giannis alongside Tatum, being thinner, relying all the more on two guys approaching their 30s and less help around them with really no way to supplement them for years to come. Or maybe having a little less talent at this moment, but still being able to lean on Tatum, having those picks to either use yourself down the line for elite players or trade for guys who become available. And in short order, getting off significant salary commitment in George, again, as soon as next summer, if you're able to move off his expiring. And it actually is, even though Giannis is so much clearly a better player than George and Jaylen, I can understand the way things are going, wanting depth, believing in their drafting and development to the level they do. And I know the Hugo Gonzalez conversation is just going to continue to get so toxic into this year. But man, like I see him in these FIBA qualifiers he's playing in right now and watching him, even in that game 7 against Philly where they finally played him. And I don't want to overvalue him because we do that in Boston sometimes, but man, at 19, 20, he was doing the things he was doing, defending some of the best players in the league, like showing flashes offensively. Like I do want to see that play out. I do want to see what Sharman can do into year 3. I do. And, you guys have been down this road in Miami. Like there's always intrigue with young players, even late round picks, even guys who like don't have that bona fide star potential. If they're showing an upward trajectory, you want to see it play out. And so it hurts that Jaylen's out the door for what they gave up or what they got back. But all their young players are packed. They have so many picks available to them now. And I know none of that's certain to pan out or become anything close to Jaylen, but that might be where the league's going. And Brad referenced that heavily yesterday in his reasoning for doing this is seeing what teams have been there at the end. Teams with depth, teams with a lot of flexibility lineup-wise. Obviously, the Knicks aren't a great example of like holding on to your picks, but they obviously cashed in on some players when the times came utilizing those. So I think that's going to be their path. Mm-hmm. Next summer, the peak would obviously be Jokic, right? If it doesn't work out with Denver, but even a lesser version of a star becoming available. I know everybody's dreaming of Trey Murphy. Like that's a name everyone loves at the moment, but so many stars have ended up in this position of being available and expendable for money reasons or anything else that you do understand them anticipating that could happen next summer. And let's be ready to strike with George's contract, with a ton of picks, maybe even some young players if necessary. Derek, you'll see in a year where he's at. So they're in an interesting place right now where they're still really good. They probably have no chance at a championship next year, but they have a lot of ammo to make that next move. That new move just has to become available, and it's uncertain. And that's the big risk here. And I think that was my other big takeaway yesterday from the press conference is they know this is really risky, what they did. And there's no certainty it's going to work. And you can imagine, Wes, a scenario, right? Next year where George is hurt, Jaylen's awesome in Philly. The Sixers are amazing, maybe even win the championship and beat you on the way. And if all 5 of those things happen, how are we going to sit there and look at Brad in a year? Like it is going to be really tough to stand by him if you're this ownership group. And that was interesting to me yesterday too, is the owner actually kind of distanced himself from the move a little bit. He was like, I had to be convinced of this and it was not easy.
Yeah. He doubled down on the fact that this was not a financial concern and things like that. And I buy that. Look, I mean, you look at Paul George's salary again, like it's very similar.
That's good cover for that. Yeah.
Now there's a difference when there's the extension talks, and they clearly felt like, hey, we can't even get into these extension stuff with Jaylen Brown. That's going to get way too
that's
sticky.
the big shoe to drop. And I feel like that was the one question we didn't ask yesterday that was important is, was he expecting a extension?
Well, if I'm Jaylen Brown, I would have, right? I just got MVP votes, dude. Like, pay me,
Yeah, so, and you'd give Tatum this extension, right? Like, you wouldn't even think twice about that.
Right.
So
Exactly.
the
So
question
look,
is
I
whether
think
there's another team out there, Philly included, that's actually going to give it to him. And so, whether Philly does that or not in 2 weeks will inform a lot of how this looks too.
that's a great point. And they don't obviously have the built-in history and equity with Jaylen Brown, so maybe they just don't feel as responsible to do
Yep.
that. I do think, look, we could debate whether or not this is the right move for the Celtics, but we're not going to know until at least for a couple of years. What is clear to me is their plan. I think that's very clear at this stage. I don't know if it's the right plan. It could not. It could be the wrong plan, but at least we know what they're doing. I think looking at Paul George as a trade asset in a year as an expiring salary is exactly right. Now they have some draft capital, some things that they could do. Look, Tatum's 28, Derek White's 32. Like, this isn't a team that can necessarily afford to draft and develop their next star, but I think they can draft and develop their next role players. But they're going to have to turn Paul George into like a guy who's probably a little bit more comfortable. And maybe it's Paul George right now, and then eventually maybe it's somebody else, but somebody who's a little bit more comfortable being that second guy next to Tatum, because like you said, they've pretty much laid out their plan. Tatum's going to be the number one guy, and our pecking order is going to fall from there.
Yeah, and I thought Tom Haberstroh made a really interesting argument too about Pritchard's capabilities of stepping up to number two. And I know there are a lot of interesting stats of what Pritchard did when Jaylen was off the floor in recent years. And just like with the Jaylen on off stuff, I think there's a lot of noise and nuance you have to place into that. And I know there's some data out there right now too of like Jaylen's productivity doesn't fall off into the playoffs and against good competition as much as Pritchard's does. Even just who they are as players, it's really hard to think that they see Pritchard stepping into Jaylen's role, usage wise, defensively, etc. All the ways that Jaylen can impact the game that Pritchard probably can't at a consistent level. But Pritchard never turns the ball over. Pritchard does, when given more shots and opportunity, produce a ton, much of the time. And even defensively, stronger than you would expect on that end. And every time he's received more workload, he's done more. And so I
Mm-hmm.
am interested to see, and I know Brad referenced this yesterday too, that like going forward, you can probably keep some players that maybe you couldn't have if Jaylen was still here, and certainly extended. So they extended Kata, which I loved. Great season for him, even with the down postseason performance. And I would expect on October 1st when he's eligible, they'll extend Pritchard too. If he'll accept it. I think it's $20 million a year he's capped at, so that gets dicey, but it could be a good compromise for both sides, that number. And he'll start next year, I would imagine. He'll get a lot of shots. He'll maybe even be that number two option, and George is more of a 3-and-D guy at this stage. And I'm interested. I'm not predicting anything. I'm not forecasting anything in terms of what Pritchard's going to do this year because, again, his productivity has fluctuated. And even last year in a bigger role, he had some ups and downs. But ultimately, again, you look at some of the isolation numbers from the playoffs for this team. Tatum struggled. He had his ups and downs coming back from the injury. Jaylen struggled immensely in isolation into the playoffs. All the offensive fouls, everything from that series, it was tough. Pritchard's numbers were through the roof. And
Mm.
at one point in that series, you were saying, like, do you have to orient this thing a little more toward Pritchard? And I feel like later in the series, they actually got away from him too much. And it's been 2 straight postseasons that I felt that way. I think Pritchard's an interesting player because people probably have like a cap on what they think he's capable of. But the circumstances in Boston a lot of the time have led to him having his responsibility capped a little bit. Even last year, he had to go back to the bench after they traded Simons. And now for the first time, it feels like he's just full speed ahead. Like he's the number 2 option, and let's see how this goes for him on top of everything else. And again, I'm not going to predict anything, but there is a scenario where we look up next year and Pritchard's averaging like 23 a game, and we're like, whoa. So I think that's another layer to this that could get interesting next season as they assess everything.
Before I let you go here, I got 3 more just general NBA topics that I wanted to ask you about. Is there an offseason move outside of Boston that you've thought about more than most people?
Oh, I don't know what's going. Well, I think everyone's thinking about the Lakers, right? So that's probably not a good answer. Let's see. More than most people. Um, I'd probably go to. Hmm. Let me think.
We could talk Lakers if you want. I mean, what's interesting to you about what they did?
I just don't understand it. I don't understand it at all. Like every piece of it to me is just baffling. The amount of picks and the money they paid to Kessler when Utah seemingly didn't want to do that. While Mitchell Robinson, like someone of that ilk, was available to them in free agency, Boston ultimately makes that move. Some of the depth players and guys they'll be relying on heavily, like Sexton, Mamukashvili, are like pretty erratic contributors in terms of their overall games. Everything there to me just feels like it's toward just making this as Luka centric as possible. And I feel like that could be good for Luka and his stat output, but I don't know how good that's going to make that team. Ja's another puzzling one in Portland. Like, and that one to me, if we go back to our Jaylen conversation, it's like, okay, you didn't want to even get involved in the Jaylen conversation. And I know they only gave up Jeremy Grant effectively for Ja, but like you feel good after the season he had and like some of the uncertainty around him going all in on him and making him like a cornerstone alongside Lillard and Avdia. That one was surprising and weird to me. And obviously there's a
Yeah.
lot of weird stuff going on in Portland. And then I guess some of the teams that stood pat, Orlando, Houston, teams that aren't in great positions, but really didn't change anything at all.
Right.
So yeah,
Orlando
those are
just
the
going
things
and
that
getting
stand out to me.
Vucevic, and Houston just going and grabbing Marcus Smart. Marcus Smart doesn't have any history with Houston, but he obviously had history with Ime there.
After pretty lackluster seasons for both
yeah,
teams.
yeah, that was. I'm with you on that. I have a whole thing earlier in the show about my thoughts on the Ja Morant stuff and the Lakers stuff, but I'm with you. Like I've thought a lot about it, but the Lakers, it just feels like they're trying to sketch out what a team around Luka ought to look like, and they're just sort of drawing the lines, and they're trying to that maybe eventually they'll fill in those pieces, but at the same time they've given up a lot to go get that Kessler guy. Where I'm like, hey, couldn't you have offered the same offer sheet to Jalen Duren? And don't we all agree? Like I know Duren had a bad playoffs, but we all think that he's a better player than Kessler right now, don't we? So they must really like Kessler, and they reportedly have liked him for a couple years. Um, your top six in the East right now, understanding that the LeBron factor still hangs over everything, and he could potentially swing, one of these spots, maybe two of these spots. But your top six in the East right now, as it stands.
I was thinking about this the other day, and it's hard. Even just stacking
Mm-hmm.
up like the entirety of the conference and where everyone stands, it was difficult. But just forecasting injuries, etc., things that you can foresee happening potentially, along with LeBron to Cleveland, as you mentioned. I'm gonna go New York 1, Boston 2. I
Okay.
think Boston holds the line. Cleveland 3, 4. I'll put Philadelphia. 5 Detroit, 6 Toronto.
So you don't think Indiana gets back?
I think Indiana's in the play-in.
Okay.
I think Miami's in the play-in, believe it or not.
So I had a
Orlando,
hard
and that.
time. I had a tough. I had a, well, it looks Atlanta's another one of those teams that basically stood pat, and actually understand where they're coming from. Like, hey, we did this before when we made a nice playoff run where we tried to go all in, it didn't work out. We had to dismantle the whole thing. So I understand the Hawks' patience here, and I think it's the right move. But um, mine's a little bit different than yours. Um, I went Knicks 1, like you. I think you have to put them number 1 out of respect. I have Indiana 2. And I am guilty of being higher on Indiana than most people. It worked out for me when they went to the finals, but that's about it. I thought they would still make the playoffs last year, and I was dead wrong. So I might be wrong on this too. But I think if you get Halliburton back, putting Zubac back into that system, I think is a defensive backbone that they haven't necessarily had. I like a lot of the players there. I think Carlisle's a great coach, and I think they lost more games than they needed to last year. So I got Indiana and Detroit. I kind of have them in the same tier, right? So I kind of tiered mine out. So I had like Indiana and Detroit in that second tier behind New York. In my third tier, I have the Heat, the Cavs, and the Raptors. I'm not surprisingly, higher on the Heat than most people. I think the Giannis, Bam, Wiggs, Spo combination is going to be. They're just going to. I understand all the questions that people have about this team on paper when they look at the roster. I just think that those guys are just going to figure it out from the most part. And I think that defense might be the best in the NBA outside of San Antonio and Oklahoma City. So I've got Miami. I've got Cleveland just because they win a lot of regular season basketball games, but I don't necessarily feel great about them in the playoffs. We'll see what happens with LeBron. And then Toronto, I think they had such a high floor last year. Their problem was that they had no ceiling. Like their ceiling was their floor essentially. Now you add Kawhi to the mix. If he's there for 2 months, I mean that could be enough to vault them up the standings here. So I've got Miami, Cleveland, Toronto in that next year, and then I got the Celtics and the Sixers in a tier below them. I think they're about the same. I think the Jaylen Brown trade kind of moved the Sixers up and brought the Celtics a little bit down to the point where I feel like they're just on the same level at this point. And then I got Atlanta as sort of a distant tier behind all those teams.
Yeah, I think Atlanta, Orlando. I do put Indiana in that uncertainty range, just because I don't know how Halliburton's going to come back from all that, and it's so it is hard to me to go from like the bottom of the league right to the top again without any friction, but it happens. And then Charlotte, like that LaMelo departure could be a real step back for them, and I don't know exactly where to place them, even though I was so high on them down the stretch. And obviously they lost the way they did, which should give me some skepticism about them going forward too. So I do place them below as well. Yeah, it'll be interesting. The East is like the West was just a few years ago in terms of how packed and crazy it is.
Yeah, and all those tanking teams at the bottom where you just like pile up free wins, like those go away.
I know
now,
Washington could be good this year.
Yeah, and these teams don't want to be that bad anymore because they don't want to be in that relegation bottom three area anymore. They want to win enough at least to stay out of that. Last thing here, Bobby. I'm not going to ask you to predict where LeBron's going to go because I don't think anybody really knows. But your favorite LeBron landing spot when you think about all the places he could end up?
I think Golden State with Davis is interesting, fun, and actually good. So I hope the Warriors actually just shell out whatever picks it takes to get him out of Washington, because I feel like the Wizards are just posturing at the end of the day. It'll be tough to swallow, but I think they should do it, and it would be awesome. Curry, LeBron and Davis back together. There's just a lot that's fun there. Miami, I'm not very excited about. I feel like he's been down that road. I don't even know how he fits in on that roster with Bam and Giannis, so I'm crossing that off. Philly, I think, could be fun and interesting, even if it would look weird. And ultimately, like, Cleveland's the boring answer, but it is probably the one that fits best in terms of story, how good they'll be, their need for him, and where he fits in on that roster. Like, he gets to be the man right away on that team and fill probably the weakest position on the floor. And I think he'd actually help them a lot. So that's a boring answer. The exciting one's Golden State. I just don't think they're going to be good enough or viable enough destination without Davis. And so I'm interested to see how they're going to handle that thing. Like, would they end up giving up 3 firsts just to get Davis and make sure they get LeBron, and almost be like a Kawhi, Paul George-esque move? But at their stage and where they're at and their alternatives, they might have to do it, because what are they going to do? Just roll forward with Curry and a couple injured guys, Jimmy Butler, another year? It's like, it's not going to work.
I mean, I'm on record enough of saying I hate the Golden State fit. I just don't want to see LeBron and Steph Curry team up. It would be a very sad ending for both of their careers to me. Like, no, you guys, I think about my favorite LeBron Steph moments. It's when they're playing against each other, like not when they're obviously playing. I know they played with each other on Team USA, but also it's one of those things where I feel like we're setting ourselves up for disappointment, where we're like, wow, look at the cast of this movie. And then we watch the movie and you're like, this movie's really not very good. Like, turns out all these actors are really, it'd be like The Irishman. We're like, wow, we really were excited for that cast. And we watch the movie and we're like, there were some fun parts in between, but that was probably a little too long. And probably all these guys are a little bit too old to do that movie.
Do you think Philly's feasible?
I don't see it. That to me is like the too many cooks in the kitchen problem. Whose team is it really? I feel like there needs to be some kind of link. And I understand that like LeBron, one of LeBron's favorite players of all time is Dr. J. Like maybe that's enough of a link, but it just feels funny to me. I don't know.
Yeah,
like,
I think given who he is and where he's at in his career, how it looks is going to be important. And that could play out in the Golden State thing too. Like he's just riding Curry's coattails at the end, even if they're great. Like that'll be a dynamic like it was with Durant. So it feels like Cleveland's a slam dunk at this point,
And
doesn't it?
the Denver thing to me is the most interesting basketball fit, but
Yeah. Is Jokic
um,
that fun to play with? That's the draw. I don't know.
I would be really excited to watch that team. I mean, that's every night programming, for me. But uh, I just have a hard time seeing LeBron in a Denver jersey. At the end of the day,
Yeah.
it's just a
Minnesota's
little
not happening
strange.
for the same reason. Like,
It's why
and
Rich Paul is
it's
out
tough
there
to
being
win in the
like, it would have
West.
been the Knicks had they not won the championship, right? And you could almost see Rich Paul and LeBron rooting for San Antonio in the NBA Finals so that they have an excuse to go to New York.
Still could be if Brunson and them decide they want it. It feels like, but I don't think they're gonna.
No, I don't think LeBron can go there. I think basically you can't go to the team that just won the championship. You can't do that, dude. Bobby Manning, you covered the NBA and the Boston Celtics over at CLNS. Thanks so much for jumping on, man. This was fun.
Thanks, Wes. Good talking to you as always.
All right, thanks again to Bobby Manning for jumping on to the show. I'm going to go through the pros and the cons of teams that have been talked about as a LeBron landing spot, and then I'm going to tell you my favorite landing spot at the end here. Well, you know what? Yeah, let's go in order. Least favorite, Golden State. The pros. Okay, the pros of playing in Golden State. And I'm not even going to talk about the money part of this right now because these teams can offer different amounts of money. Golden State could free up enough money to offer the full mid-level. I get that. Draymond Green opting out, clutch client, all that stuff. I get it, okay? LeBron has already, or Rich Paul really has said that it's not going to be a money decision. I don't really know what that means. You're going to have to pay LeBron something. I still find it hard to believe that he'll just take the veteran minimum, right? I just think that because of the reputation of and what that kind of the label that puts on a guy, but I could very well be wrong. I have no idea, and because I have no idea, I'm not even going to venture. So I'm going to focus mainly on the basketball fits and some of the emotional components of all of this. Golden State, my least favorite LeBron landing spot. It sounds like, based on some of the things that Rich Paul has said on his podcast, that maybe that's starting to fade a little bit. Doesn't sound like they're going to be able to get Anthony Davis. If they can't, then it becomes a little bit less desirable for LeBron. And you looked at Rich Paul's whiteboard, and Golden State was off to the side. They weren't even one of the core teams anymore. So that move might be fading a little bit. I'll tell you why I liked it potentially. LeBron fits a need there for playmaking. I can't even fake it. I hate everything about this. I understand that people think that LeBron and Steph is a basketball dream fit. I get it. Not really at this stage anymore. I mean, this is not 10 years ago, people. This just felt like this would have been setting us up for just some really sad basketball where games where LeBron and Steph both looked old. LeBron and Steph need to be next to guys in their prime right now. They can't be at risk of both looking old on the same night. We can't do that. That is way too sad. For all the when you think about Steph and LeBron, I understand people, oh wow, like Steph shooting threes, LeBron, they met so many times in the finals, but now I get to team up and all these things. I'm telling you, if this happens, it's going to be sad more often than it's exciting. They're just too old. All right? These guys need young players or guys in their prime to play off of. They cannot team up anymore. And I also just don't want to see them on the same team. I didn't want to see Magic and Bird together at the end of their career. To me, the best moments for LeBron and Steph have been when they play against each other. Team USA notwithstanding, those are the moments. It's when they play against these living legends, kind of getting the best out of each other because they're playing against each other. I don't think we get that if they play with each other. I just don't want to see it. I don't want to see it. My next on the list, Minnesota. The pros, LeBron can play off of Anthony Edwards. I quite like that. Rudy Gobert is a defensive backbone. I quite like that. I think it's a well-coached team. It's also that team that's right there on the cusp of championship contention that you could talk yourself into LeBron joining that team and putting them over the top. And the thing with Minnesota that I find that they cannot do, even after their long playoff runs over the last couple of years, they still don't really know how to pace themselves in the playoffs. It always kind of feels like they have a high and then a low. LeBron can help them figure out how to pace themselves in a playoffs and for a full 4 series. This is how you approach the postseason. LeBron can teach those guys that. Something that they still don't really have figured out. So I like that. I like LeBron mentoring Anthony Edwards. I like all of it. What I don't like is LeBron playing with LaMelo. I don't like that. I think Minnesota needs to play faster, not slower. Ant is a little bit more methodical, but he's not methodical in the way that LeBron or Luka or Harden is. He's methodical because it kind of just takes him a while to figure out what the play needs to be, right? Like he's not this passing genius the way that these other guys are, who are just sort of queen on the chessboard, moving the things all around. Ant just like takes a minute, okay? So that's why they're more methodical. And I think the argument is that they need to play faster, right? That might not be Rudy Gobert's strength, but I don't really care. It's LaMelo's strength. It's Ant's strength. It's Jay McDaniel's strength. It's some of the younger guys on that roster, Tan Shan Jr., all these guys. Like, they got to go fast to create an advantage. And LeBron's not going to do that for them. There's also going to be a little bit like, okay, it's Ant, and then it's LaMelo, and then it's LeBron. Who has the ball in our hands? How do we stagger these minutes? What's really going on? And do we really want to get older? Where I feel like the Timberwolves need to work on building the team around Anthony Edwards. And LeBron, you're not investing a ton in him if he doesn't really need all this money, but you're investing a lot of time and energy into the LeBron stuff. So I kind of liked it at first, and then the more I thought about it, I was like, yeah, you know what? I don't really love this for Minnesota. To me, there's other ways that they can go about leveling up. Next on my list is Philadelphia. I get that people are intrigued by this. I do like the idea of LeBron James going back to the Eastern Conference. To me, I know that he played with the Lakers for 8 years. He's an Eastern Conference player to me. So I like the idea of him coming back to the Eastern Conference. I kind of like the story of him ending up in Philadelphia. One of his favorite players is Dr. J. He never played for Philly, obviously, so he doesn't have the same sort of history that he has with Miami or Cleveland. But he does hate Boston, right? And so playing with Philly, Boston's biggest rival, and then teaming up with Jaylen Brown, who now also probably hates the Boston Celtics, although he won't tell you that, but in his statement and stuff, but obviously has to feel a type of way. And the history between Philly and Boston in the playoffs, a big part of LeBron's story is beating Boston, right? And so, yeah, I'm kind of into it from a storyboard standpoint. I hate this basketball fit, though. I hate it. This is the ultimate too many cooks in the kitchen. You've got Maxey, Jaylen Brown, Joel Embiid. They're still trying to figure out how they want to play with Maxey and Embiid, and then they just added this Jaylen Brown, I want my own team element into the mix. And by the way, VJ Edgecombe was really good as a rookie, and I just don't want to keep taking stuff off of his plate. We already did that with the Jaylen Brown trade. If LeBron's in there, I'm worried that this guy's going to we're going to stunt this guy's growth. And I think this guy could be an all-NBA guy. So I don't love it for Philly. To me, you made your big move with Jaylen Brown. You got to figure out the Embiid stuff with all of this. Clearly, your group going forward is built around Tyrese Maxey, Jaylen Brown, and VJ Edgecombe. That is something I need to figure out more before I add the LeBron element into all this. So I like LeBron and Philly as a story. I really hate it as a basketball fit. Next on my list is Cleveland. I think most people assume that he's going to end up in Cleveland. All right, maybe that's true. He could totally end up in Cleveland. It's got the nostalgia. It's home. You look at where he positions himself. Okay, we've got Harden, Donovan Mitchell, Evan Mobley, Jarrett Allen. I play the small forward in between all those guys. When Mobley or Allen come off the court, I slide over the 4. From a basketball fit, I actually do think it makes sense, although I do hate LeBron and Harden being on the same team. But you could stagger their minutes. You could figure it out, whatever. Donovan Mitchell becomes a full-time off-ball player, or an 80% of the time off-ball player, whatever it is. They would make it work, but it's still like a lot of guys who need the ball in their hands. Evan Mobley, who you are already at risk of having him plateau, and if he's really the future, I don't know that you want to do that. It's a really top-heavy team that doesn't have a ton of depth, and that makes me nervous. But I could see the basketball. You could talk me into the basketball fit. Although I don't love it, but you could talk me into it. I actually hate this as a story. And I think this might be the riskiest of all the moves. He already did this. He went back to Cleveland and won them a championship. You did that already. If you go back to Cleveland, the expectation then becomes, I can deliver us the championship again. And if you fall short, I worry that almost diminishes the 2016 championship. I probably sound crazy, but that becomes now the last thing that you did. And I even know, 2016 obviously wasn't the last thing he did in Cleveland. He lost 2 more NBA Finals after that, but you did it already. You delivered for the land. You did it. So I just don't know that that's necessarily the move. My favorite landing spot for LeBron James is Miami. I know you're all surprised. I understand that there's probably some homer bias here. I get it. But to me, you've got the story fit of, hey, I was really only here for 4 years. I probably could give you a couple more, another year or two. I played longer with the Lakers. I played longer in total with Cleveland. Let's run it back in Miami. You haven't won a championship since I left. I can help bring back a championship. And you've got a history with Eric Spoelstra, Pat Riley, Bam Adebayo, Spo and Bam from Team USA more recently. Spo was your rebounder, right? When you were warming up for Team USA. You have a very strong relationship with him. It's the best coach out of this whole group by far that you would be playing with. And by the way, they just got Giannis. So you think about what I just said about Golden State, where if I'm LeBron at this stage of my career, I need to play off of somebody in their prime. Giannis is that guy. I could play off of Giannis, but it's also not to the point where I need to figure out how to share the ball with them because we play the same way, because they don't, right? LeBron is essentially walking in as the point guard of this team. This team really needs playmaking in a bad way. LeBron, with the Lakers, didn't get to have the ball in his hands anymore because that was Luka's job. So he had to play this tertiary off-ball role. That's not how LeBron wants to play. LeBron wants the ball in his hands. He'll have the ball in his hands in Miami, but he won't have to do all the scoring, and he's not going to have to do all this defense because behind him, he's going to have Giannis, Bam, and Wiggins. And he'll be playing with Davion Mitchell, probably. You've got a bunch of really good defenders. Pelle Larsson coming off the bench. You've got a bunch of really good defenders bracketing you where you're not going to have to do a ton defensively. You can do all the things that you want to offensively. I understand that there's spacing concerns, but there's, as we've covered, basketball fit concerns with all of these teams. There's no clean fit here. But I think this fit makes the most sense. And if I'm LeBron, gives me the thing, allows me to play the way that I want to play the most. And I got to do it in the Eastern Conference for a team who needs what I can do with a realistic shot of making a playoff run, winning a playoff series. And I get to do it with the best player outside of Jokic on this list, in Giannis, and the best coach on this list, and a front office with a proven ability to build around stars and develop guys and get the most out of my teams. To me, Miami is the best fit. But you're probably not surprised. RealGM Radio with Wes Goldberg is part of the RealGM Radio Network. Check out Mo DeKill and Jared Dubin on the Double Dribble every Monday and Wednesday. On Thursdays, it's Good Take with me and Mike Shearer, where we share the best NBA takes that we've cooked up this week. Stay tuned. Thanks for listening.